People who grew up middle, upper class, what did you not believe about low-income households, but it was actually true? Story 1. I didn't have a concept of kids not having new toys, clothes, and electronic devices. The idea of something being pre-used, I thought only came from yard sales, and you didn't have to get things that way. It was just better because they often had toys you couldn't find at a store. The idea of going to bed hungry, I thought only happened in third world countries. I'd seen homeless people, but believed they were alcoholics. In general, anyone struggling for the basics of life, I really just didn't understand. My school had a breakfast program for kids who were less well off, and I thought they just went there to hang out with friends or their parents who were too lazy to make them breakfast. I didn't understand why some kids couldn't go on field trips. Family vacations seemed normal to me. But I think the worst of it all was believing my family was actually poor. We didn't have the newest toys or electronics as soon as they came out. Our clothes came from Walmart, and we were never out of the country for a vacation. My parents were always complaining about not having any money for bills and things they wanted to do, but as I got older, I realized they just didn't manage their money well. We lived in a house they owned, had enough food that a lot of it went bad, had mountains of toys and lots of video games, and were generally getting $500 to $700 worth of new things each at Christmas. Living on my own with no financial support from them has taught me a lot, and I'm grateful about that. I just wish I had understood this growing up, so I knew how lucky I was. Story 2. I'll share a story that woke me up. I was a manager on a PC refresh where we had employees out in the field. Since they were traveling, one of their perks was that we gave them $50 a day for food. All they had to do was send in their receipts. I was approving receipts for a week and noticed that one of our employees had only submitted a receipt for $25. So I called him to make sure he understood how the reimbursement process worked and to ask for the rest of his receipts, which typically were around $300 a week. He told me that all he bought for the week was bread and bologna, since he didn't have the money to front the expenses, which is why the receipt was so low. I was floored, and that is when I started to realize what it means to not have any savings or access to credit. Needless to say, we fronted him the money the next week. My boss asked me to buy a $50 part out of pocket the other day, and he'd pay me back when I got back to work. And I was thinking, dang, if we hadn't just gotten paid, I would have had to tell him I couldn't buy it. Luckily, I got to avoid that awkward interaction. Story 3. Eating out at restaurants isn't common for everyone. My mom gave a girl on my basketball team a ride home from an away game. I can't remember the reason. We decided to grab a bite to eat and asked her if she had a preference. She picked a buffet place, saying that it is where her family goes. Turns out it was the only restaurant she'd been to, other than fast food from time to time. A few months later, she was with us at an Italian place that was slightly upscale. She didn't know how to order, so my mom did it for her. For dessert, she asked for cherry cheesecake, and then whispered to me that she'd just scoop the cherries off. I flagged down the server and had them change it to plain cheesecake. I felt so sorry for her because she was just uncomfortable. I also realized I was pretty spoiled and appreciated my parents much more. I hated going to restaurants with friends when I became old enough to go because my family literally never ate out, so I didn't know what to do. I would get really panicky placing an order and never knew the etiquette for, say, asking for a refill. My husband, funnily enough, has the opposite problem and used to freak out when he has to go on public transportation. Story 4. I grew up poor. When I went to prom, a rich girl in one of my classes gave me a dress. She knew my family's situation and just brought it to me in a bag a couple of weeks before the dance. I hemmed it and cut off the sleeves. I was at home the day of the prom, doing my hair, makeup, and nails myself. It shocked me that all the other girls were at salons. I was a punk and wore band tees and combat boots usually. I showed up to the prom looking really good. Everyone was shocked, and the principal even came over to me and commented on how I looked. I hated almost everyone at my school, but that night I felt like I belonged. I can share my experiences growing up poor, like eating 2 pieces of bread with just mustard and ketchup on it for dinner, or when my mom would beg the water company for a few more days to come up with the money for the bill, but they'd shut our water off anyways. We'd use bottled water to bathe and brush our teeth. I'm what you would call well off now, and I appreciate the heck out of everything I have and how far I've come. I'm glad I grew up the way I did. I think it made me a better person. I'm not pretentious or judgmental, and I love helping other people out, because I can now. Story 5. Grew up dirt poor in the country. Things middle-class people didn't believe. People don't live in single wide because they like it. They do it because it's all they can afford. Out in the sticks, a double wide with good underpinning is middle class. Having a garden is not a whimsical thing that people do for kicks. It can be the only way you eat decent veggies. A space heater is how you stay warm when keeping the trailer heat on will result in $400 utility bills, and that's more than rent and trailer mortgage. I learned to shoot a gun at 12 because I had to help put food on the table. A single deer is good meat for a long but while. There are people who are 1 generation removed from outhouses, if they haven't actually used one. If there is a snowstorm, canning keeps you alive, because the power will be out for 2 weeks sometimes. My grandmother literally fed 10 people one winter for a week and a half. People join the military in relatively high numbers because it's the easiest way out of crushing poverty, or about the only way they're going to college. Hey, 1 generation removed from the outhouse here. My mom and her siblings had to take baths in a metal trough outside too. Heat up some water on the wood stove to make it a bit warm and all that. 1-bedroom cabin with a well to draw water from. Of course, this was in Arkansas in the 70s, so yeah. Story 6. I grew up in a middle-class home and am now a teacher in a Title I, aka lower income, high school. I always knew that there were people who were less fortunate, but my first year of teaching has been a real eye-opener. 5 to 7 kids sit in my room during lunch every day. I noticed that 1 student either didn't eat or had a Coke and hot Cheetos. I learned that he only sometimes had lunch money, and if he did, it was only $2 or $3. This December, many students didn't have enough warm clothes, and of that portion, most walk over a mile to and from school. Many don't have the money for school supplies, let alone lab fees. Only some classes have lab fees, mine don't. I bought big boxes of granola bars and paper, binders, etc. to give to the kids whenever they need, but as a fresh from college 22-year-old with $45,000 in debt, there's only so much I can do. It sometimes breaks my heart, but I hope being a good teacher and mentor helps them in ways that money can't. Just FYI, Title I schools give free breakfast and lunch to everyone who chooses to get it. Some of your kids may not know that. They don't have to qualify, get their parents to sign papers, or anything. Just get in line. Story 7. What it meant to not be able to afford something, or to be broke. My parents would say we can't afford that, but it really meant we'd rather spend that $1,000 on ourselves or on our next vacation or whatever instead of on a new toy or computer or phone for you. We're broke means we've used too much money in our checking account. We'd still have savings accounts and investments, of course, so no money really just meant no more money than we should be spending right now. Because I grew up this way, I viewed money as something that just magically never ran out. I would get really annoyed when my friends would say, I can't afford that, or I'm broke, as a reason for not doing something, because I viewed it as an excuse instead of a reality. The first time as an adult when I literally couldn't afford something because the $50 check I had deposited hadn't gone through, and so my debit card was declined, was a surreal and horrible feeling. I suddenly understood what I'm broke and I can't afford that really meant. Story 8. My wife and I grew up very blue-collar. Now we're doing quite well for ourselves. What was really hard for us to realize is how much people rely on each other at the blue-collar level. People don't have much, so they have social networks to help each other out. Go to any blue-collar neighborhood, and you'll see kids outside playing, adults out socializing, people working on their cars, etc. Go to an upper-middle-class or wealthy neighborhood, and for the most part, you won't see those things. Poorer people need their social network to survive. The difficult part for the upwardly mobile is that once you make enough money to leave blue-collar life, the social protection tends to go away as well. Randy down the street isn't going to fix your furnace for a case of beer. Your neighbor Jim isn't going to help you dig that hole in your yard in exchange for watching his kids so he and his wife can see a movie tomorrow night. Stuff like that does happen with the wealthy, but not nearly as much as with the lower income folks. To us, at least, it seems like the more a person gains in wealth, the more they lose with the sense of community. I could be wrong. Story 9. I went to private school, and there was a girl that I assume was on scholarship or financial aid, and she always smelled really bad. I saw her putting on deodorant in the bathroom once, and I guess I must have stared a second too long because she told me that she didn't have anything clean to wear because her mom didn't have money for the laundromat that week. I couldn't believe that people had to wear dirty clothes until they could go to the laundromat. I just thought everyone had a washing machine in their house. A high school by me recently added a laundry room for students to use if they had a need. They can talk to the coordinator, move loads between classes, and have clean clothing available by the end of the day. Story 10. I was so poor as a kid that the week of the month the government cheese block was delivered was exciting for me, and horribly depressing when the cheese ran out, because it meant 3 more weeks of no cheese. It was exciting because everything else I ate was so bad that this cheese was delicious and the only real highlight in my life at that point. I recently got that's why a lot of people growing up would put hot sauce on everything, because it would make bland food tasty. Unfortunately, even with growing up poor, I don't like hot sauce too often. Story 11. It rather isn't a case of not believing, but one of having no awareness. I heavily underestimated how deep-rooted the cancellation, sorry, can't, no money, goes. For me, financial refusals always meant that I'd rather spend it on other amenities. No international vacation for me because I want that fancy bag or coat. Or let me rephrase precisely, I have money, just alternative investment priorities. I am by no means rich, just a normal middle class and only child. But I took far too long for the realization that someone who has not enough money to partake in something had probably a long way of canceling fun and frustrating calculations before that. Story 12. It's not something I disbelieved, just something I didn't know or understand. That it is a matter of course that they make sacrifices in order to help their friends, family, and community members. I used to advise at a community college with a largely impoverished student population. Every now and then, a student would tell me a story that boiled down to something like, I didn't get to study for the final exam the night before because my neighbor's car broke down and I had to give him a ride to work. I was baffled by how often I heard something like this. In my world, you would apologize to your neighbor and say you absolutely have to study for the exam tonight. But I eventually learned that when you grow up in poverty, you help that neighbor because you don't know when you might need their help. Looking out for number one is not how you survive in that world. Story 13. If I may, I grew up in the middle class until the recession of 2008. That's when both parents lost their jobs and we went to food stamps. I realized that vacations weren't things we took every year. Expensive toys couldn't be bought right then and there. We were lucky to have 3 meals a day every day. My parents lost the house, and we still haven't gotten back to where we were. But I do appreciate how hard my parents tried to provide everything for us. Story 14. That some people have never been out of state. I thought that everyone took vacations multiple times a year. Some people never leave the county they grew up in. 25 plus years ago, I drove my sister, her friend, and a few others to the amusement park, and that was the first time my sister's 15-year-old friend had been out of the county we lived in. Note, county, not country. Counties are what US states and UK countries are subdivided into, along with other countries. Story 15. I always thought people talking about their fridge being empty was an exaggeration. Like there's plenty of food, just nothing you want to eat. Then I started dating a girl who didn't have a lot of money, and I opened the fridge door and saw only Hawaiian Punch and ketchup. And I was just like, well, crap. Those couple days between the last shopping trip running out and my parents' next paycheck was the worst. Scrounging to put together a meal, but always coming through, my mom was an angel. Story 16. That you could reach adulthood without ever learning to read. I had a McJob where one guy wouldn't date and label the food he prepped. It turns out he wasn't just cutting corners, he didn't know how. It blew my mind that not only would the school system let him reach adulthood without teaching him to read, but that he could function in today's society with only knowing a handful of written words. My dad didn't learn how to read until he went to prison in his early 30s. Story 17. Minor inconveniences for normal people, parking tickets, a malfunctioning fridge, a flat tire, etc., are potentially catastrophic for poor people with no financial cushions. Literally everything you just listed made my heart jump into my throat to even consider, and I'm doing okay right now compared to where I was 5 or 10 years ago. I'd consider every one of those to be a major expense. Story 18. I'm really late to this, but here goes. I didn't realize that some kids had to work to help their family pay the bills. I realized this at military boot camp. I joined the military because I failed out of college the first go-round. My bunkmate got his first paycheck and told me how excited he was to send it to his parents so that they could pay the electric bill. I got my first paycheck and left it in my footlocker because I didn't have any other use for it. He later told me that he joined the military because he knew that the electricity would always be on. Story 19. Eating squirrels is an actual thing. My family used to subsistence hunt. Squirrels were one of those animals you could always count on there to be a lot of. First time I cooked a squirrel for my wife, she thought I was joking. She grew up feeding cute little squirrels in the park. My mom used to hunt for our dinners when I was a kid. Squirrel, rabbit, pheasant, deer, ducks. I'm sure we ate stranger crap too that she didn't tell us. Story 20. I ride horses, and I was shocked to learn that one of my friends had never been on a horse before. Her response was, "Horseback riding in America is not a poor person thing." I moved to Boulder a few years ago, and I constantly have to explain why I don't know how to do things like tennis, golf, skiing, etc. I even was poor growing up with rich people, and I never learned from them. Story 21. That people on food stamps were people trying to game the system. Now I'm an adult on food stamps, and it's the only way I can make ends meet. We get so much stigma and hate. The other day, someone on Facebook posted about people on food stamps having $600 phones. I have an Obama phone, and it doesn't work half the time. Story 22. From the flip side, when I was in college, I actually lost friends because I couldn't afford to do the activities they did, like going to bars every weekend, or going to multiple concerts or raves and festivals over the summer. It was partly about not having the money, and partly about not being able to take time off work. It was embarrassing to be 20 and tell other 20-year-olds I couldn't afford what they took for granted. So I'd tell them I didn't like bars, or I didn't like raves. They took that to mean I didn't like them. Story 23. That people used credit cards because they didn't have the money at the time, instead of a convenient way to earn points by paying cards off in full each month. I learned this after moving away from university. Turns out loan payments and paychecks don't always come in at convenient times. Story 24. That you could actually try really hard and still not get hired for a better job. I grew up thinking if people just tried harder, they could get a better job. I had no idea that so much is stacked against people living in poverty. That most live $200 from insolvency, where a fender bender can result in losing transportation, which can result in losing a job, which results in losing where you live. Story 25. That some kids only got hand-me-down clothes and rarely got something new of their own. Only time I got new pants, socks, underwear, and blankets was on Christmas, and that meant money was spent on essentials, not pleasures. People seemed shocked that I was freaking stoked to get new socks. Story 26. In the UK, I have genuinely encountered people from wealthy and rural backgrounds who genuinely thought that house numbers were only an American thing, and that every house in Britain had a name. I'd hate to be a postman if that were the case. Story 27. I went to high school in a nearby city and befriended a friend who lived in the projects. She lived with 3 grandparents, 2 aunts, her mother, 2 sisters, and herself in an incredibly small 2-bedroom 3rd-floor walk-up. I didn't think people lived like the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory family, but this family did. They all shared beds, and the grandparents stayed in bed in the living room 90% of the time. Story 28. I have no idea how a person is able to support themselves. I thought I knew everything coming out of high school. What I found out was that I lived in a super small bubble. I have friends that don't have parents and who grew up essentially homeless and are doing amazingly well for what they have come from. A lot of this revelation was also attributed to me moving out as well. Story 29. That not everyone has a passport. People give Americans crap for this, but it's pointless to have one if you're so poor you'll never be able to leave the country anyway. Story 30. That some families are so poor their children only went to school for the free food. There are programs to feed those children during school holidays because they usually only get a meal at school. Story 31. Not something I couldn't believe, but something I didn't really realize. The temperature of the house is strictly controlled in the houses of lower income people that I know. When I was a kid, I'd turn the heat up to 80 and set the AC at 65. Story 32. When he was growing up, my dad had 2 shirts and 2 pairs of pants. When he was wearing one, he hand-washed the other. Then he spent his whole life making sure his kids and grandkids would have more than he had. Thanks, Dad. Story 33. I dated a girl that was from a very rich family, and she would never turn lights off when she left any room. I would walk around the house and turn lights off, and she didn't understand why. Story 34. Kids doing bad at school were not always bad students or lazy. They didn't have enough to eat, were malnourished, and couldn't concentrate. Story 35. That many kids did not eat lunch at school because there was no program or their family just didn't have the money or resources. Story 36. When I got to college, I realized that some students were paying their own way. That was humbling. I wasn't exactly from a rich family, but couldn't get my mind around that. Story 37. Just how little money people are paid. When I was younger, I figured that approximately $40,000 a year was the lowest someone could earn. Story 38. You don't just get up and go to the doctor when you're sick or for a yearly physical. Story 39. That all your brothers and sisters sometimes sleep in the same bed or on the floor. Story 40. That some people can't afford to fill up their car with petrol. Story 41. Those kids had to help pay the bills. Please leave your stories in the comments. I'd love to make a video of them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.